Aristotle's political theory. Even in the Eudemian ethics, it is the service and contemplation of God that sets the standard for the appropriate exercise of the moral virtues. And in the Nicomachean ethics, this contemplation is described as a superhuman activity of a divine part of ourselves. Aristotle's final word here is that in spite of being mortal, we must make ourselves immortal as far as we can. When we turn from the ethics to their sequel, the politics, we come down to earth. Man is a political animal, we are told. Humans are creatures of flesh and blood, rubbing shoulders with each other in cities and communities. Like his work in the zoology, Aristotle's political studies combine observation and theory. Diogenes Laertius tells us that he collected the constitutions of 158 states, no doubt aided by research assistants in the Lyceum. One of these, the Constitution of Athens, though not handed down as part of the Aristotelian corpus, was found on a papyrus in 1891. In spite of some stylistic differences from other works, it is now generally regarded as authentic. In a codicil to the Nicomachean Ethics, that reads like a preface to the Politics, Aristotle says that having investigated previous writings on political theory, he will inquire, in the light of the constitution collected, what makes good government and what makes bad government, what factors are favorable or unfavorable to the preservation of a constitution, and what constitution the best state should adopt. The Politics itself was probably not written at a single stretch, and here, as elsewhere, there is probably an overlap and interplay between the records of observation and the essays in theory. The structure of the book, as we have it, corresponds reasonably well to the Nicomachean Ethics program. Books 1 to 3 contain a general theory of the state and a critique of earlier writers. Books 4 to 6 contain an account of various forms of constitution. 3 tolerable, monarchy, aristocracy, and polity, and 3 intolerable, tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. Books 7 and 8 are devoted to the ideal form of constitution. Once again, the order of the discourses in the corpus probably differs from the order of their composition, but scholars have not reached agreement on the original chronology. Aristotle begins by saying that the state is the highest kind of community, aiming at the highest of goods. The most primitive communities are families of men and women, masters and slaves. He seems to regard the division between master and slave as no less natural than the division between men and women, though he complains that it is barbaric to treat women and slaves alike. Families combine to make a village, and several villages combine to make a state, which is the first self-sufficient community, and is just as natural as is the family. Indeed, though later than the family in time, the state is prior by nature, as an organic whole like the human body is prior to its organic parts like hands and feet. Without law and justice, man is the most savage of animals. Someone who cannot live in a state is a beast. Someone who has no need of a state must be a god. The foundation of the state was the greatest of benefactions, because only within a state can human beings fulfill their potential. Among the earlier writers, whom Aristotle cites and criticizes, Plato is naturally prominent. Much of the second book of the Politics is devoted to criticism of the Republic and the laws. As in the Ethics there is no idea of the good, so in the Politics there are no philosopher kings. Aristotle thinks that Platonic communism will bring nothing but trouble The use of property should be shared, but its ownership should be private. That way, owners can take pride in their possessions and get pleasure out of sharing them with others or giving them away. Aristotle defends the traditional family against the proposal that women should be held in common, and he frowns even on the limited military and official role assigned to women in the laws. Over and over again, he describes Plato's proposal as impractical. The root of his error, he thinks, is that he tries to make the state too uniform. The diversity of different kinds of citizens is essential, and life in a city should not be like life in a barracks. However, when Aristotle presents his own account of political constitutions, he makes copious use of Platonic suggestions. There remains a constant difference between the two writers, namely that Aristotle makes frequent reference to concrete examples to illustrate his theoretical points, but the conceptual structure is often very similar. The following passage from Book 3, for instance, echoes the later books of the Republic. Here is the passage. The government, that is to say, the supreme authority in a state, must be in the hands of one, or of a few, or of the many. The rightful true forms of government, therefore, are ones where the one or the few or the many govern with a view to the common interest. Governments that rule with a view to the private interest, whether of the one or the few or the many, are perversions. Those who belong to a state, if they are truly to be called citizens, must share in its benefits. Government by a single person, if it aims at the common interest, we are accustomed to call monarchy. Similar government by a minority will be called aristocracy, either because the rulers are the best men, or because it aims at the best interests of the state and the community. When it is the majority that governs in the common interest, we call it a polity, using a word which is also a generic term for a constitution. Of each of these forms of government there exists a perversion. The perversion of monarchy is tyranny, that of aristocracy is oligarchy, and that of polity is democracy. For tyranny is a monarchy exercised solely for the benefit of the monarch. Oligarchy has in view only the interest of the wealthy, and democracy the interests only of the poorer class. None of these aims at the common good of all. Now that was Republic 3, 6, 1279, 826 to B10. Aristotle goes on to a detailed evaluation of constitutions of these various forms. He does so on the basis of his view of the essence of the state. A state, he tells us, is a society of human sharing in a common perception of what is good and evil, just and unjust. Its purpose is to provide a good and happy life for its citizens. If a community contains an individual or family of outstanding excellence, then monarchy is the best constitution. But such a case is very rare, and the risk of miscarriage is great. For monarchy corrupts into tyranny, which is the worst of all constitutions. Aristocracy, in theory, is the next best constitution after monarchy, but in practice Aristotle preferred a kind of constitutional democracy, for what he called polity is a state in which rich and poor respect each other's right, and in which the best qualified citizens rule with the consent of all citizens. The corruption of this is what Aristotle calls democracy, namely anarchic mob rule. Bad as democracy is in it, where are we now? Bad as democracy is, it is in Aristotle's view that the least bad of the perverse form of government. Okay, let's say that again. Bad as democracy is, it is in Aristotle's view the least bad of the perverse form of government. At the present time we are familiar with the division of government into three branches: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. The essential of this system is spelled out by Aristotle, though he distributes the powers in a somewhat different way from us, say the US Constitution. All constitutions, he tells us, have three elements: the deliberative, the official, and the judicial. The deliberative element has authority in matters of war and peace, in making and unmaking alliances. It passes laws, controls the carrying out of judicial sentences, and audits the accounts of officers. The official element deals with the appointment of ministers and civil servants, ranging from priests through ambassadors to the regulators of female affairs. The judicial element consists of the courts of civil and criminal law. Two elements of Aristotle's political teaching affected political institutions for many centuries: his justification of slavery and his condemnation of usury. Some people, Aristotle tells us, think that the role of masters over slavery is rule of masters over slaves is contrary to nature and is therefore unjust. They are quite wrong. A slave is someone who is by nature not his own but another man's property. Slavery is one example of a general truth, that from their birth some people are marked out for rule and others to be ruled. In practice, much slavery is unjust, Aristotle agrees. There is a custom that the spoils of war belong to the victors, and this includes the right to make slaves of the vanquished. But many wars are unjust, and victories in such wars entails no right to enslave the defeated. Some people, however, are so inferior and brutish that it is better for them to be under the rule of a kindly master than to be left in their own devices. Slaves, for Aristotle, are living tools, and on this basis he is willing to grant that if non-living tools could achieve the same purpose, there would be no need for slavery. If every instrument could achieve its own work, obeying or anticipating the will of others, like the statues of Daedalus, if the shuttle could weave and the plectrum pluck the lyre in a similar manner, overseers would not need servants, nor masters slaves. So perhaps in an age of automation, Aristotle would no longer defend slavery. Although not himself an aristocrat, Aristotle had an aristocratic disdain for commerce. Our possessions, he says, have two uses: proper and improper. The proper use of a shoe, for instance, is to wear it. To exchange it for other goods or for money is an improper use. There is nothing wrong with basic barter for necessities, but there is nothing natural about trade in luxuries as there is in farming. In the operation of retail trade, money plays an important part, and money too has a proper and an improper use. The most hated sort of wealth getting is usury, which makes a profit out of money itself, rather than from its natural purpose, for money was intended to be used for exchange, not to increase an interest. It got the name interest, lokos, which means the birth of money from money, because an offspring resembles its parent. For this reason, of all the modes of getting wealth, this is the most unnatural. Aristotle's hierarchical preference places farmers at the top, bankers at the bottom, with merchants in between. His attitude to usury was one source of prohibition throughout medieval Christendom of the charging of interest even at a modest rate. When did friendship, Antonio asks Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, take a breed of barren metal of his friend? One of the most striking features of Aristotle's politics is the almost total absence of any mention of Alexander or Macedon. Like a modern member of Amnesty International, Aristotle comments on the rights and wrongs of every country but his own. His own ideal state is described as having no more than 100,000 citizens, small enough for them all to know one another and to take their share in judicial and political office. It is very different from Alexander's empire. When Aristotle says that monarchy is the best constitution if a community contains a person or family of outstanding excellence, there is a pointed absence of reference to the royal family of Macedon. Indeed, during the years of the Lyceum, relations between the world conqueror and his former tutor seem to have cooled. Alexander became more and more megalomaniac and finally proclaimed himself divine. Aristotle's nephew, Callisthenes, led the opposition to the king's demand in 327 that Greeks should prostrate themselves before him in adoration. He was falsely implicated in a plot and executed. The magnanimous and magnificent man, who is the hero of the earlier books of the Nicomacheus Ethics, has some of the grandiose traits of Alexander. In Eudamian Ethics, however, the alleged virtues of magnanimity and magnificence are downgraded, and gentleness and dignity take center stage.